Join us on a journey toward a freer world through sound economic policy and a love for individual freedom. Welcome to Free the World.
Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Free the World. I'm your host, Josh Eckel. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that many people are wrestling with an election year on the horizon. The question is whether political violence in America is getting worse. And today, we're going to talk to a man by the name of Fischer. Ford is an independent journalist. He's a filmmaker, a primary source documentarian. He's the editor-in-chief of an organization called News to Share, and his work's been featured in Oscar, Emmy, and Golden Globe-winning films. And his footage you've probably seen from notable events like January 6th, insurrection on the Capitol, and the Charlotteville March in 2017. I'm going to bring Ford on. Bring him on now. Good morning, Ford.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for taking time to talk to us. We're huge fans of your work. So I wanna frame the conversation a little bit before we jump into some specific questions and kind of contextualize this a little bit about some of the conversations that we had at the Students for Liberty's International Liberty Con back in February. So you led a panel discussion on the main stage talking about this issue, the rise of political violence, and you asked some really good questions. So we want to build on that a little bit and get your perspective on some of the issues you brought up. So Nick Gillespie, who, for those of you that might not know, is the editor-in-large at Reason Magazine, said at one point in the conversation that he was not overly worried about political violence in the way that it used to be used with groups like the Weather Underground, which was incredibly violent in the 60s. And he's instead thinking it's moving to this kind of sporadic model, like what we saw in Charlottesville or January 6th, where it's not necessarily a slow burn, but just kind of a hot flash. And so I'm curious, just to kick us off a little bit, Ford, do you agree with him? How do you feel about that assessment about where we're headed in the next couple of years?
It's kind of a funny position to be in as a having moderated a panel and then being asked, tell me if the panelists were right. But with that being said, I think that a small maybe difference of opinion about the way you just kind of like described sporadic is that these situations don't happen sporadically, right? So in the case of Charlottesville, I think that to people watching on the mainstream media, it may have sort of felt like it came out of nowhere. But the alt-right movement that sort of led to what happened in Charlottesville really escalated over the summer leading up to it, where there was a number of different rallies, many of them which included various sort of street fighting and so forth, and in other cases just the speeches, but you could hear the sort of rhetoric getting more fiery. And then about the rally itself, they had announced it more than a month in advance, and so it kind of gave both sides very significant time to prepare for that particular event. Similarly, January 6th, I think to a cable news viewer might have felt like it kind of came out of nowhere, or like it was an instantaneous response to the certification or the upcoming certification of the Biden win. Or as the media has kind of reframed January 6th since then, that it happened because Trump tweeted in December, "Be there, will be wild." But I think sort of like, again, in reality, being on the ground in the time period leading up to January 6th, there was sort of a sequence of escalating conflict really beginning at election time. So once the election happened, Trump said that it was stolen. The people around him kind of surrounded that idea. You had a Million MAGA march that brought thousands of Trump supporters to Washington, D.C. on November 14th, 2020. You had a second Million MAGA march on December 12th, 2020. Both of those saw sort of street fighting with counter-protesters. There were also many adjacent rallies at state capitals all over the country throughout those couple months before. And so January 6th only looked on the media sort of like it was in a vacuum, I think because the media largely ignored all of the stuff that led up to it. And so this has been sort of a phenomena that I take issue with, because it makes these situations look so one-off or spontaneous. And the reality is that movements kind of build up. So like in the context of right now, as we're recording this on May 1st, 2024, there was an incredible amount of violence kind of over the last 72 hours at assorted college campuses, largely by the police trying to push pro-Palestine demonstrators out that had set up encampments at various campuses, as well as in the case of UCLA, there was basically brawling between Zionists and anti-Zionists on the campus. That whole situation, similarly to people kind of just watching in the media, might appear as though it had sort of started in some kind of a spontaneous way, that the Columbia encampment just kind of came out of nowhere and whatever. But it has been the culmination of a political protest movement that has been probably the most sustained movement related to foreign policy in my lifetime. And so things escalate, and they escalate to these points that might appear to be flashpoints in the mindset of kind of Americans watching the news and getting that kind of surface level look at them. But I do think that they fit into a wider pattern. So as we look at what kind of political violence will we see in the next year, I think that it's somewhat hard to predict, but I do think that it's easy for me to say that this will be an extremely contentious election where it's hard to imagine that you will have a population consensus about its outcome. And I think that that certainly could lead to various types of violence, whether it be in the manner of individual one-off threats, individual acts of terrorism, political rallies that turn violent. I think there could be any number of different directions. And it's hard to compare that to a situation like the Weather Underground. It's hard to say, oh, it'll be worse or it'll be better than some previous era in the United States. But I certainly think that political violence, both by the state and by activists of one side or another, is still a tool that is very much being used by these people with certainly mixed results.
Noted. Okay, well, I mean, that kind of leads to my next question a little bit, which is thinking about how these movements and how this violence has evolved over time. I mean, it feels to me, and I'm curious as to whether you agree with me on this, Ford, it feels to me like, and I think social media has played a role in how these movements evolve. Right. I mean, the movements that we saw in the 60s were not characteristically, I think, identical to what we see now, at least in the way that they took shape and formed and materialized in the real world. So maybe could you talk a little bit about that? Do you feel the same way? Can you maybe talk to a bit about how some of these movements have evolved over time and maybe the role that social media might play in that?
Yeah. So the way that social media has impacted these movements has changed even in the course of the last 10 years, even in the time period that I have been covering them. Until mid 2020, Facebook was a very popular organizing space. It was very easy, actually, for me to just sort of lurk in various Facebook groups and just follow popular Facebook pages. And when people were organizing some kind of a demonstration, they would just post about it. There'd literally be a Facebook event like muster the militia at blah, blah, blah place. And so it would be really easy to follow that kind of thing because people would organize so much in plain sight. The anti-fascist left of that time period was a little bit more cognizant of the way in which social media can compromise operational security. And so while the left was certainly doing more demonstrations in that kind of early Trump era period, well, really all 4 years of Trump, but I would say especially pre-George Floyd's murder, there was this time period where in Washington, D.C., for example, people would talk about it like, what protests are we going to? Like where should we go for brunch? And so those you would be able to find basically a calendar of political protests just by looking on Facebook. After August of 2020, when the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting occurred in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Facebook took a very different stance toward how they would allow political activism to be organized on Facebook. And in particular, they basically began getting rid of whatever they perceived as militarized movements organizing on the platform. And so you no longer had people setting up Facebook events that would say things like, you know, show up with your guns at this place or whatever. Yeah. You also had, after January 6th, a really big kind of awakening on the right wing about the manner in which social media can compromise, operational security. Basically, that you're advertising your plans into the world, and that could cause your rivals or the government to sort of be aware of what you're doing in a way that has adverse effects. And so kind of the result of that is that both political sides, if you will, and it is more complicated than two sides, but in generality, both sides have backed away from using Facebook. There are still announcements of events on Twitter and so forth, but there's also a lot more sort of decentralized platforms like Telegram, like people using word of mouth via things like Signal, which makes it more complicated. And also, to be clear, more complicated for journalists. It's certainly more difficult for me to have to do the research to find out where things are going to happen, as opposed to when I could basically just pull up Facebook and it more or less generates a calendar.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's definitely clear, I think, to a lot of people that in 2020, Facebook made some serious decisions to deboost specific, not even just the specific instances you mentioned. It just seems like political content is kind of the way the algorithm handles that. It's completely shifted. I am curious to see how that materializes this election year, because I feel like, the nexus of this stuff might be like Twitter or other platforms that have looser restrictions on that type of content. Okay, well then maybe we could go a little bit to touch on a comment you made about the both sides thing. So John Hersey at LibertyCon, he's a writer for the Objectivist Standard. He alluded multiple times that political violence was kind of a construct of the left. And one of the things that he had said was that violence brought by Trump was because he was using leftist language and kind of that framing. Again, not asking you to critique the panelists as much as just maybe react to that sentiment. What do you think? Do you think this is an accurate statement? I mean, what do you think the primary causes are that drive people to commit violence? Maybe any broad thoughts on that kind of big picture question?
Yeah. So John Hersey's comment was basically that anything kind of authoritarian or statist or violent within the instincts of the right wing, in his opinion, sort of places it within the conversation of the left wing.
Sure.
I don't want to say that I sort of agree or disagree with the panelists or what have you, but I will say that sort of in my own work, I've tended to find that the best policy about political labeling is more or less to label people the way that they actually identify. And so what I mean by that is that if somebody would basically affiliate with the right wing, right, then I wouldn't cast a label onto them and go, nah, they're left wing, right? Sure. And so I can understand why a philosopher might try to kind of pick apart these ideologies or make comments like that. But for me, I don't think that it's especially useful. I do think that what can be more useful, though, is to, instead of just using broad terms like left or right, which have so many different factions among them, it is preferable for me to describe exactly what kind of person or activism that we are talking about. So, for example, I tend only to use the word Nazi if the group that I'm covering is literally some kind of National Socialist group, swastikas, this sort of thing. I understand the political instinct, especially on the left, sometimes to just call any kind of far-right group Nazis. I tend to be very specific in my language. So a group like Patriot Front has espoused white nationalist ideology. I tend to use the term white nationalist or fascist because they literally use Mussolini kind of as their required reading within that group. But I don't use words like Nazi to refer to a Trump supporter or something like that. Certainly, unless there's an actual specific indicator, like a revering of Hitler or something like that. Sure. So, as it relates to political violence, though, as a tool, I don't know that the proclivity toward violence is specifically characteristic of any various political movement. I think that the state certainly uses political violence, or almost intrinsically it uses political violence. And I also think that both sides of the political spectrum are capable of using political violence. It was sort of my experience, I would say, especially in the time period before January 6th, that the right wing on the ground, like at various street protests, took the posture of kind of wanting to go into situations that they would end up in fights, but they would try to not sort of throw the first punch. Whereas the anti-fascist movement would view themselves as forming community self-defense by physically aggressing on right-wing events that they viewed as sort of existentially threatening the community, right? And so the way that I once saw this described, because I described this phenomena at one point, and then it was cited actually in a book, and the author used terms that made more sense to me than the words that I was using. What the author described is that during that time period, what was popular on the left might be referred to as sort of stealth violence, right? So they view it as community self-defense, but physically they're beginning the fight in order to deplatform or whatever. To essentially, in practice, this means right-wingers have a rally, leftists view the rally as sort of threatening people in the long run, so they try to break up the rally, possibly using force. And the right-wingers, knowing that this will be the tendency of the left, would engage in escalation dominance. And escalation dominance basically means they are allowing that fight to start, and then once it has started, they get to sort of use the aspect of self-defense in order to engage back in the fight.
Sure.
The other thing about that whole time period, I would essentially say pre-election, is that the right wing was strongly aligned with the state in power, right? So Donald Trump was the president. And again, not that all right-wingers love Trump or whatever, but broadly speaking, the sort of street fighting forces, the Proud Boys, militia groups, and so forth on the ground were kind of aligned with Trump, and the people on the left were broadly disaligned with Trump. And so the right would act almost in a way that was complementary or trying to be complementary toward the police, where I would see militia members literally shake hands with police or say, we're here to help you, we're here to assist you, that kind of thing. And so I viewed them during that time period as, in a sense, for some of them, a kind of a paramilitary, sort of aiding the state in the context of sort of an American battlefield. When the election occurred and Joe Biden won the election, but there was dispute about that, there was a feeling of kind of power being lost over time by the Trump supporters in those couple months after. And so over the course of from November until January, and I mean leading up to January 6th, but I'm not including January 6th in this necessarily, like the Trump supporters had a gradual falling out with the police that I think that the media largely failed to document, but it helps understand the mindset of the Trump supporters on January 6th. So just to use some really quick examples, at the 2nd Million MAGA March, December 12th, 2020, so less than a month before January 6th, Trump supporters were on the streets that night. And as they're running around DC, they are hoping to physically confront counter-protesters who were out there. And the police would, as they generally are obligated to, essentially stand between the people on the left and the people on the right. However, that night was different. It was more antagonistic, where the right-wingers were literally yelling at the police, "Why are you protecting them? You've lost your way." In some cases, I heard them adopting kind of left-wing slogans like defund the police.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about that to me was it appeared as though even though the police took the same physical posture and tactics that they would anyway, the right-wingers were experiencing this moment as losing that grip of power, right? Trump was the president who was sort of with them, and he's losing his presidency. The situation is becoming more and more desperate for them. And so their relationship with the state sort of went from a paramilitary one to an insurgent one. To give one other example of that phenomenon, and I know this is long-winded, but it's a theme that I think really, really helps understand January 6th, is on January 1st, 2021. So we're talking about 5 days before January 6th. There was a hybrid Stop the Steal and also anti-lockdown rally in Salem, Oregon. And so you had a kind of coalition of what I would broadly call the right wing that shows up at the Capitol in Salem, Oregon. Some of them have thin blue line flags, literally police supporters at the event. Like that's the symbology they're wearing. We love the cops. And as the rally concluded, there were a number of counter protesters, and in a sort of similar situation, the right-wingers wanted to go physically confront them. The police blocked them, and they ended up trying to sort of push past or into the police in order to get to the people on the left. And the result of that was that the police ended up shooting sting balls and pepper spraying and tear gassing them. And in the course of the fallout of that, people were screaming at the police, what the F is going on? They were shocked that this was happening to them because they had spent 4 years watching this happen to the political left. And by the end of that night, one person actually was stomping on their Thin Blue Line sweatshirt that they had brought to the event. So someone who was a Thin Blue Liner, a police supporter at the beginning, by the end of it is literally like anti-police in the context of this situation. So I think that this was another example of, during that time period, losing that feeling of alignment with the state changed their perspective, even with local police, from a sort of statist one out of that feeling of alignment to an anti-statist one, at least for their purposes.
Noted. Yeah, I remember some of these images coming out of that time. So I again, this is, I think, also a good pivot to kind of the next big question that I had for you, which was, and I think we know the answer is that we see both, political violence on both sides. As you mentioned, you see it with the far left, see it with the far right. But do you feel like people are kind of blinded to the political violence on their side? I mean, I point to anecdotes from after like January 6th, where I remember hearing, the people that stormed the Capitol were Antifa, right? Things like that, where they kind of try to find a way to rationalize it on their side, and then they're hyper aware of the other side. Can you maybe speak to that phenomenon? Do you think it's true? Just big picture response to that one.
Yeah, I think that there's been a tendency that is almost just natural or expectable kind of in our political world, which is that whatever violence is perceived as being aligned with one side is typically minimized by that particular side, whereas the violence that is considered to be the violence of the sort of rivaling side is tends to be either exaggerated or at least worthy of greater attention by the side that's considered opposed to them. An interesting aspect of that is that there has been a tendency, especially post January 6th, to actually write off the side considered to be in alignment as non-existent or otherwise fabricated. So, kind of as you mentioned, in the post January 6th world, right, like there have been an extremely minimal number of January 6thers who have been identified as some kind of infiltrator, right? There is the example of John Sullivan, who was just sentenced to 6 years, who was not a Trump supporter, but who had infiltrated both leftist organizations throughout 2020. And then he wore a MAGA hat on January 6th and was trying to egg on the crowd. But these are some pretty rare edge cases. For the most part, there has been very minimal evidence that January 6th was sort of perpetrated by anything other than Trump supporters. With that being said, there has been a tendency among the MAGA movement to look back at it and say, well, it was instigated by feds. I've seen certainly evidence that there were informants at the Capitol. I have not seen evidence that there was informants egging on violence in such a way that it would not have happened were it not for the presence of that kind of people, or that it was quote unquote Antifa. And again, the only example that's even remotely close to that is a person who had infiltrated both leftist movements as well as the right. There's also a tendency on both sides to emphasize sort of the proportion of peaceful aspects of the demonstrations being defended. And this one, I think I give a little bit more credit to on both sides. But it's interesting to kind of place them in context. And I think you would probably find it fairly rare to find someone to point out both of the things I'm about to say. So as it relates to January 6th, the Justice Department says that they are going to prosecute somewhere in the ballpark of 2,000 people for January 6th. That it's their estimation that and that number keeps climbing up a little bit. So maybe we scrape 3,000, right? But probably 2,000 to maybe 3,000 people for January 6th will be prosecuted. There's some number of hundreds of people who engaged in violence. If you ask Donald Trump, there was 1 million people in Washington, D.C. that day there to support him. I think that number is certainly in the hundreds of thousands, although I really hate guessing crowd sizes. But even if you very conservatively call it 100,000, you would still be left with 3% of people who attended the Save America rally on January 6th who actually engaged in illegal activity at the Capitol. So on the one hand, January 6th was extremely violent. It was probably the second most violent situation that I had ever personally witnessed and documented. On the other hand, if someone were to say 97% of Trump supporters who were in Washington, D.C. for January 6th remained peaceful, that would also be a true statement.
Yeah.
Doing the example of the left, I've seen this same kind of thing be the same kind of rhetorical device be used. It is true that if you look at kind of the statistics of crowd counting, I don't remember the exact number, but it's something in the ballpark of like 97% of Black Lives Matter aligned or otherwise anti-police brutality aligned demonstrations during the summer of 2020 that remained entirely peaceful. And indeed, that was kind of my experience. I went to dozens of them, and I witnessed violence at relatively minimal of them out of that. Certainly not more than 10%. So on the other hand, when somebody says, if somebody says most Black Lives Matter aligned protests in 2020 were peaceful, in fact, like well over 90% of them were peaceful, that's also an absolutely true statement. But when Fox News is able to say, here are images of the 3rd precinct of Minneapolis being burned to the ground, here's footage of the establishment of a Chaz where there's people like shooting each other and so forth. They can point to these examples and go, these are really violent situations. And those things can also be true. So, I mean, there's a lot of rhetorical kind of gambiting on both sides that's kind of meant to escalate the violence of the opposite side and de-escalate the violence of one's own side. And that same kind of rhetorical gambit about denying the alignment of the side or suggesting that it's artificial has applied, I would say, maybe to a lesser extent, but it does happen on the left as well, where, for example, even as you had an entire anti-fascist movement strongly prominent over 4 years, you had Jerry Nadler say Antifa isn't real, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so I could go into that in more detail, but I'll wait on you to ask the next question.
No, yeah, you're good. Yeah, you're totally good. I was going to say that one of the things that I would mention is that that effectively is why I think the work that you do is so incredibly important, right? Like making sure that somebody is there to document the truth as to what happened in the situation and have a record to go back to really helps undermine those false narratives or mischaracterizations that come out of it. So I think that's incredibly valuable. We could touch on the situation with Antifa if you'd like. And one of the things I did want to maybe, as we kind of pivot towards the end of this conversation, talk about was specifically a statement that former Congressman Joe Walsh made on the stage about how Donald Trump is specifically unique in his rise in his role in the rise of violence here. Obviously, I think no one would deny the fact that Trump is a unique individual. And I think everyone would agree with that. But I think the question I'd have for you is, do you think that he is unique in the context of political violence and, based on your experience? Yeah.
So, I mean, Trump has ignited emotions in people in a way that there has never been a specific kind of political candidate before who was able to do so, right? There were not people street fighting over John McCain, right? Nobody's putting on like McCain 2008 and then like brawling with the like Obama supporters or something like that. Like did not happen. People care a lot about individual political issues, and so political violence for that reason has certainly happened throughout kind of all presidencies, and in some ways irrespective of who the president actually is. But Trump himself ignited so much emotion that he almost himself became a single issue, right? So in the course of, as I would cover, largely peaceful demonstrations of people protesting against Trump over those 4 years, they might be itemized into specific things. Women's march is about women's rights, something about abortion rights, something about the environment, an anti-gun thing, right? Like there would be these individual things. But for a lot of the Trump supporters, going out there and doing a rally for Trump would literally be a rally for Trump, right? They also could have single issue things, right? They could go out and say we're having a gun rights event or whatever, but Trump became a political issue in and of himself that people are kind of willing to dive into conflict over. I also think he ignited enough passion that, as opposed to a specific issue, he was somebody who people would actually fight for in particular. So while this is not a legal analysis, right, people can talk about like kind of who incited January 6th and so forth. And so I'd like to kind of like dodge that element of what I'm about to kind of bring up. Sure. But people on January 6th were motivated by wanting to keep Donald Trump in particular in power. And regardless of the question of his own kind of culpability or incitement in making that happen, I don't think that you would very easily find any other politician who would inspire either kind of insurgent violence to protect their presidency or insurgent violence to prevent it. It is also my opinion that a real possibility for 2024 is that if Trump does win the election, I would imagine a response, not among most anti-Trump people, but among some number of anti-Trump people that would essentially look like insurgency, right? There would be some number of people who would say this is an existential threat to our country, and anything or much more than what we would consider to be democratically normative is necessary in order to kind of prevent his presidency. I guess we'll find out what happens on that front. But to your question, I think that Trump ignites that kind of emotion on both sides in a way that no other politician in my lifetime has.
Understood. Okay, well, then maybe we could talk about go forward in the future. I don't think anyone's under the illusion that if Trump, say, does lose or wins and then leaves office, that political violence is going to end. This is characteristic of political systems in many ways. But what do you think the future holds for political violence in general as we go through this election year? As you mentioned, at the time of this recording, we're witnessing massive student movements across the country, unlike what we've seen in at least 4 years, probably since BLM in 2020. Where do you think we go from here?
I think that it is hard to say. What's interesting as we're doing this recording is that college graduations are coming up. And so the demonstrations that largely rely on students being present at their college campuses are going to end soon, or possibly by the time that this recording is out. However, the summer is about to begin as we're leading into an election year. Joe Biden's perceived kind of complicity in what's going on in Gaza has been a flashpoint for political activists that I would broadly call the left, although it's not sort of perfectly aligned in a left-right spectrum that way. And so I do see kind of a historic disappointment among young people with the incumbent Democratic candidate. It will be interesting to see how that translates, given that I think conventionally you would think of what would happen in 2020 as kind of like pro-Trump versus anti-Trump, and anti-Trump would in some way be aligned with Biden. But right now, the real animating political factor is this foreign policy issue that really has positioned those activists against Biden. It's been very common for me to hear people who would typically be thought of as on the left, and who I'm sure still self-identify as on the left, saying that like Biden is not our candidate. They're literally calling him Genocide Joe. And so that probably is seriously weakening his confidence, I think, in the ability to win the election. In any event, so I think that it could be more complicated. The factions could be more complicated. Another aspect of 2024 that I think will be different as it relates to political violence than in the past sort of couple of waves that we've talked about, really like 2017 and 2020, is that organizationally, at least for the right, I think that it's become drastically more complicated because of their level of paranoia and sort of fear about one another. And what I mean by that is that in the wake of January 6th, there has been so much discussion on the right wing of feeling like they've either been infiltrated or that every kind of existing right-wing group is some kind of a Fed op. And that sort of fear of informants and so forth has led these types of folks to be really hesitant to actually organize with each other in close-knit groups, which is a pretty fundamental characteristic of the previous kind of two waves of political violence that we discussed. And so I think that whatever happens this year, probably on both sides, will be a lot more decentralized in some way. And I think that the result of that can be a lot more variable. Are people just going to show up at flashpoints without organized groups? Are people going to sort of take more lone wolf approaches to situations, sort of given that political organizing is more difficult? I think that it's hard to say, but I certainly don't think that it's going away.
Understood. Obviously, at Students for Liberty, we want to promote, tolerant discourse, level-headed thinking, fact-based framework to look at the world. To close this out, I'm curious as to what you might recommend, or just any thoughts on how people in our space, or just people broadly, can help move society towards a more peaceful, tolerant, open discourse environment. I mean, that's a challenge. It's difficult to solve, but I'm curious to take us out kind of where you think there might be any opportunities there.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a challenging question. And the reality is I spend more time documenting than I do on any kind of like advocating. But sure. I do think that a cause of a lot of this conflict is the otherization of people on the ground, that people are willing to engage in violence because of, in a lot of cases, kind of like hyperbolic thinking about what the other side is or represents, the dehumanization of people's sort of rivals. And so I would suggest that if people wanted to reach a more peaceful outcome to any kind of dispute resolution, they would have to be willing to engage in serious dialogue with whom they consider to be their rivals. I think that is difficult in the era of Trump. I think that like the proposition of respectful discourse in this time period has become really difficult, where the level of cynicism among either side about what their opposites kind of represent, I think, has reached really a boiling point. And so I'm not sure about the feasibility of that in terms of the left-right paradigm in the United States today. But on the whole, I will say that anger and fighting doesn't usually seem to actually create meaningful outcomes or change that people actually want. In general, most of the time that I've witnessed people attempt political violence, it usually creates vast blowback against them. It ends up being a weapon against the violence's perpetrator. And so it's usually not actually essentially helping anything.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with you. Well, Ford, I always enjoy talking with you. We obviously appreciate the work that you're doing and urge you to keep doing it, and also stay safe, both you and your team, as you go into this election year, because it's going to be incredibly fraught. But before we close this out, I just want to say, do you have anything you'd like to plug or tell our audience about that maybe they might be interested in? Learn more about your work?
So my outlet is called News to Share. That's news, the number 2 share. So that page, News to Share, is on Facebook, as well as YouTube. The channel is called News to Share, and on Twitter, it's at N2S Reports. And I'm Ford Fischer at FORDFISCHER on Twitter.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Ford, have a wonderful day. Stay safe again, and we'll see you soon. And I'll take us out here.
You too. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, Free the World is a production of Students for Liberty. Students for Liberty is a elite network of young leaders pushing for pro-liberty ideas in every inhabited continent across the globe. If you're interested in learning more about Students for Liberty or joining our local coordinator program to get the tools and resources that you need to take your life and your career to the next step, you can join us at join.studentsforliberty.org. You can also give to SFL with sfldonate.org if you'd like to support the work that we're doing to promote these ideas across the world. But we'll be back again soon. I want to say thank you to everyone for watching, and have a wonderful day.